As leisure time grew, the pressure on the community to provide facilities for leisure time also grew. One of the outlets for these, especially since the 1980s, has been the so-called culture houses. These are essentially buildings that can be rented on a short-term lease by NGOs for various activities. These are mostly public buildings, but there are private culture houses also. I will focus this video on the heritage of the buildings rather than their present use. As a consequence, this is neither a complete nor even a comprehensive list. This is only a list of the buildings that were purpose-built as culture houses. The most common former use for a culture house seems to be schools. It makes sense because education is a volatile political subject. Fluctuations in demography, economy, and political ideology makes schools, especially primary schools, sensitive to whoever is in power. As a result, Copenhagen community, like many other communities, were faced with surplus school buildings from time to time due to mergers or straight closures. And these buildings have shown themselves to be well suited to be converted into culture houses. It makes sense because all those classrooms can usually be converted into meeting rooms, and it usually also comes with a canteen that can be used as a base for a cafe or the like. Although sometimes the building is so small that its best use is probably to turn it into a museum. Schools are obviously not the only type of public buildings that can become obsolete. It also happens to barracks, like the former home of the Horse Guards. Or how about a water tower? This particular water tower is under building preservation, so the community had to find a use for it now that it's not feasible as a water tower anymore. It's interesting both from an engineering point of view, because it's one of the first uses of reinforced concrete in Denmark, but it's also interesting from an architectural point of view because it's one of the first examples of modernism. The curious thing to become obsolete is a crematorium. Thing is that during my lifetime we have gone from about 80% inhumation to about 80% cremation, and due to demographics you would expect that there is an increased use of crematorium space. However, also in this respect, industrialization have led to bigger and bigger units. So the small crematoriums on the individual churchyards have been replaced by larger centrally placed. The same thing has happened to butcheries. Instead of having one slaughterhouse in each town, we now have mega slaughterhouses, few places in the country that delivers to all of the country, and of course to export. In Copenhagen, there was a public slaughterhouse rather than a number of private butcheries. In the gray zone between public and private, you find the public transportation. Technically, they were private companies, but they served exclusively a public purpose. Tramways, now completely gone from the country, has left some sheds. And of course, there's always the railway. In this case, it was a private line to Slangerup, which was made obsolete by a rerouting of the entrance to the city. With the deindustrialization, a lot of industrial buildings became available. Many were torn down, some were turned into residential buildings, and some survived as culture houses. One example is the former warehouse for the Holmdal oil mill. The factory is better known for its production of paint and lacquer, and this particular building was, however, sold for use as a print shop. Another lacquer factory lies in Valby, and a small building to the left is also part of the culture house under the guise of the power station, although it looks more like a manager's mansion. Also in Valby, on the other side of the railway tracks, we find the remnants of one of the two big porcelain factories in the country. Mostly known for its household items like plates and cups and figurines, they also produced things for the industry. And this building was constructed specifically for the testing of ceramic isolators. If you were in doubt what they produce here, you can just look on top of the entrance. It was light bulbs. Sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint a single product, as you have a whole conglomerate of buildings that has been turned into a combination of library, culture house, youth house, and such, and therefore you can just say, well, various industries. An example that can stand as a testament to the whole development from an agricultural society to the post-industrialism is the Willow Yard. It started out as a regular farm with a sideshow as a basket weaving workshop, which turned out to be more lucrative than the agriculture. It was then sold to a pharmaceutical company, and when they stopped production to move further out into the suburbs, this was turned into a public research institute called the Technological Institute. And when they also moved out to the suburbs, it was finally turned into a culture house. When the city expanded, it overran the surrounding villages and eradicated the farmsteads. Some few of these exist as torsos. The country houses would typically be parceled up and the main building torn down. Catenius Minna survived this because it had been turned into an institution. The last owner of the country house died without issue, so he testamented all of his estate to the foundation of an institution for handicapped. This institution technically still exists, but has been a public institution for a long time and relocated. Sometimes even residential buildings have been turned into culture houses, like the former home of Karen, Barbara, Anna, Josephine Nicolaisen. She was 50 years old when the house was built, and it operated as a kiosk for the visitors for the neighboring hospital. Closer to the city, there are very few villas, and if they survive, it's typically because they are owned by the public or under building preservation. It simply do not pay to have such a house when you can develop it into a high-rise. Let's end with one of the first of the culture houses, if not the first. It's simply called the house. The house is actually four different buildings, one of which formerly hosted a brewery.